Hi, this is Laura with a quick and fun interactive card for you. Last month I made a dancing Santa card, and last week I used the same mechanism with this sassy girl from the Pure Innocence Cute-a-tude stamp set from the November Vault release. When we move the lever or pull tab back and forth, she strikes a pose. I filmed the process and thought I could share it with you today. First, we need to do some partial stamping with a Copic-friendly ink, like the Extreme Black Hybrid ink. I already stamped the head and the dress separately off camera, and here I'm stamping the legs onto a white panel cut with the third largest die from the A2 stitched rectangle STAX at Dynamics. It measures 3¼ by 4½ inches. We can cover the panel with some thin scratch paper or a post-it note in such a way that only a part of the image transfers onto the panel. When we're done with the stamping, we just need to do some fussy cutting and coloring, which I did off camera in order to shorten this tutorial. Using a black marker which doesn't bleed to carefully color the edges of our fussy cut images is always a good idea. For an extra festive touch, add a little bit of shimmer to the dress with one of these special markers. You can also add a couple of drops of glossy accents to some of the details. However, remember to always get rid of the first drop, which usually contains air and can ruin your project. Let's move on to the mechanism. We will need the largest die from the Spin and Slide Channels Dynamics or something similar to cut the lever, and the small and medium-sized connectors from the Meet in the Middle Interactive Dynamics set. I always layer my interactive elements with liquid adhesive for extra strength, although for this card you might get away with only one layer, since there isn't a lot of stress on the mechanism. Let's apply some adhesive and fold the little tab in the middle to make it sturdy, as well as the perfect size for our card. Next, we can loosely link the two connectors together with a mini brad. I previously stamped the Pure Innocence girl on a piece of acetate in order to assemble her correctly. You could of course use the printed acetate sheet from your stamp set for this, but I didn't want to ruin it. And once everything is lined up on our panel, grab a piercing tool and make 2 holes so that we can link our very simple mechanism to it. Before we move on, let's check that it's moving correctly, and oops, I forgot to tighten the prongs on the lower brad. Okay, now we can adhere the pull tab to the larger connector with some score tape or liquid adhesive. If you don't have a small triangle-shaped enamel dot, you could cut a triangle out of cardstock and cover it with glossy accents, or just stamp an arrow from the interactive label stamp set directly onto the pull tab. I had already put away my die-cutting machine and was feeling lazy, so instead of cutting the donut pieces from the Meet in the Middle Interactive Dynamics set and stacking them with glue, I simply grabbed a thick foam dot and cut a hole in the middle of it. Then I glued it to the first brad. Here's where the head will go. Then I used strips of thinner foam squares for the larger connector. It doesn't really matter what type of dimensional adhesive that you use, as long as it doesn't interfere in the movement of the mechanism. When I adhered the body in its place, I noticed that you could see a little bit of white cardstock under the skirt, so I carefully peeled off the body piece and colored the leg a little bit higher up. I also took advantage of the situation to switch the bulky golden brads for smaller white ones. Okay, we're ready to adhere the body parts to the mechanism. The piece of acetate is really useful for this, but you could totally just wing it. And while we're at it, just let me remind you that this easy mechanism is adaptable to a bunch of stamps. In my Santa card, for example, I used a longer connector for the head and upper body and a shorter one for the legs. Let's have a look at our sassy lady in action one more time before the final assembly of the card. I cut an 8½ by 5½ inch white card base and adhered a piece of pattern paper from the Candyland paper pack to it. I also die cut a second panel out of gold sparkle cardstock. As always, you can find a list of the supplies as well as the measurements in the description box below. If you have any questions or comments, I will happily answer them. Thank you so much for your company today, and until next time, hasta luego!